Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hi there, friend. Merry Christmas. We have for you today a special episode where we interview Agilists and Scrum Masters that have influenced us with their work, but are probably not on the top of your speakers list at your local conference. Yves, the co-host for the Tips from the Trenches audiobook, handpicked 5 groundbreaking Agilists that you will not get to hear anywhere else, but here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, you will hear from them and learn from their experience. I hope you enjoy this Christmas special that we bring to you in this 2020 special Christmas. I hope you enjoyed the show, and Merry Christmas! Welcome everybody to this very special Christmas 2020 episode, and we have with us Yves Hanoulle and Rashina Hoda. Hi guys!
Hey!
Hello.
So it's a pleasure to have Rashina and Yves on this very special Christmas week episode. As I said, this is a different episode. Yves and I have a challenge, kind of a gift for you guys listening to us in this weird 2020 Corona year. So as we can't go to many conferences and we want to meet other Agilists, I pose a challenge to Yves. Let's invite 5 excellent Agilists that people don't often hear from. And he's done that. Rashina is our first guest for this week. And Yves, of course, is the co-host of Tips from the Trenches, the audiobook. So Yves, introduce our guest for us.
Esther Derby proposed Rashina for my first book, Who's Agile? I was sold when I read that she did a doctoral thesis on self-organizing agile teams. Back in 2019, when my daughter and me, we spoke at Agilinda, I briefly met Rashina, yet unfortunately, we didn't have the time to have a good conversation. So I was looking for names. Rashina was literally the first name that popped into my head because I thought, let's meet her for real now.
That's perfect because she's also our first guest.
Indeed.
So, Rashina, this is kind of a special episode. We want to get to know you and what you know and the experience you've had in the Agile world. So how did you get started with Agile? What was perhaps the trigger moment that told you that, focusing on Agile was the way to go?
Look, I think the one moment that I can recall that was, as you say, the trigger moment for me was sitting in a course at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And this would have been 2005 during my master's program, and being introduced to Agile software development. So the Agile manifesto, just learning about the whole concept, and then moving into things like extreme programming and Scrum. And I just found myself completely mesmerized by the whole concept, because all my life as a software engineering student, I would have come across, very super technical aspects like, learning programming, Java, C++, things like that. And suddenly here we are in a course and a program sitting there and talking about people, right? So I was like, this is cool. I mean, there's room for talking about human and social aspects in software engineering. And not only is it some side project, it's front and center. So I was completely taken and have still been for all these years with Agile since then.
Okay, so if you had to pick out one personal lesson from your Agile journey to share with our listeners, what would that lesson be?
That's an excellent question, Yves. There are so many lessons, but I think one that I would pick out that is, I guess, particularly relevant to this year is just our ability to deal with uncertainty. I think this year has shown more than any other time, how important it is to just be okay with not knowing what's going to happen next, right? And all of us have been forced to do that. Whether we had growth mindsets to begin with or not, we've been forced into that mindset during this year. And that's one thing that I think has really served me well personally during this time, this difficult year, is just being okay with uncertainty and applying those Agile principles around, look, you can chop out this really large problem or even your so-called regular schedule into smaller chunks and take it a day at a time. And it's okay if I'm not sure what the next day looks like, but I can take it at smaller, iterative, incremental process one day at a time. So applying it to your everyday life, that's been really valuable to me.
Taking that a bit further, I know because we've talked a little bit in the prep that you're actually a researcher. So you're not working with Agile software development, you're working with Agile in the context of doing research. So tell us a little bit more about how you do that in your own work, right? Like split the work into smaller chunks and take it one day at a time as a researcher.
Yeah, as I was telling you, Vasco, before, my engagement with Agile is threefold. So one is the research side of things. And that's where I actually do step out into the industry and I talk to actual software developers, Agile practitioners, and look at how they practice things. And that's where my research sort of studies that in the real world and then comes up with theories about how things are working. So that's one aspect. The second is, of course, I've been teaching Agile for a really long time, so to university students. And third is what you just mentioned about applying Agile principles to the process of research itself. And if I could right now, I would show you the back of my wall behind this laptop with all my little Post-its. So the way we do it is sort of like quasi-Scrum. And the idea there is to have a kind of a product backlog for the items that we're wanting to deal with. So for example, I would have swim lanes of different research papers I'm currently working on. So some of them, a combination of sort of Scrum, Kanban-ish, Scrum-banish. And so you would have columns where some research papers are in the planning, bare ideas that we have. Some would have been in the sort of in progress. So we are actually writing them. Some are actually submitted, are being reviewed at the moment at journals and conferences. Some have come back and we are supposed to make revisions and so forth. So there's a pipeline, there's a rhythm to the research process. And Agile helps to sort that out and make sense of it. And I can visualize it and I can track it. I can estimate things. And also it makes for a really good mechanism to share with the rest of the research team. So we use sort of Trello, for example, we can use if there's a larger team. Otherwise, we've got our physical boards.
So when you as you study Agile and then you transform that into like lessons that you give to your students, first, I'm sure you've had some very puzzled questions from students. I remember being in university and believing that software development was all about writing documents, not really talking to people, but writing the analysis document, writing the fluxograms, the PER charts, like all of that. And not really, we were never told how to talk to people. Like literally, I finished university knowing how to program, but not knowing how to collaborate. Like, how do you turn that around? Because that is a key aspect of software development in the modern times.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think I'll allude to the course that I was teaching at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And there, the sort of model I had set up for that course was in three parts. So the first of it was just the fundamental theory side of things. And I would tell them, the whole Agile principles, Scrum typically, and a little bit of Kanban and so forth. And then the middle chunk of that course, which was a 12-week course, the middle chunk of it was an actual Agile project with local industry. And so that's where then you go ahead and have to practice those, the method and the practices that you've been hearing about in the real world. And the most important aspect of it, as you rightly pointed out, was the actual collaboration and sometimes negotiations with the customers and the collaboration side of things. So there's nothing better, I think, than actually letting students try it out for real. It was a lot of work to coordinate something like this, to bring in the industry partners and to let students work on those projects. But it was totally worth it, I think, for the students as well as for us and the customers when we saw the project come to an end successfully. So these were short, like feasibility projects, but they applied Agile principles. And just for completeness sake, that last part of it was critical research. So you would go and then reflect on your journey and compare how, what it said in the book and what they actually practiced. Yeah. So yeah, collaboration, communication, all of those skills we talked about, but then we practiced for real with the actual customers.
And the feedback loop that they had, what they learned about it, did you reuse that for the next year?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, one of the things we did was We collected the data from the course, and then we actually wrote it up as a paper, which is the Adapting Agile for University Context. So it just didn't just benefit the course in the next running of my own course, but hopefully it's also benefited other people who have then gone ahead and read that paper to try and apply it in their Agile courses.
Is it paper somewhere online? Because we might give it to the listeners or link to that if it's open.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'll just share the fact that most of my papers and preprints of those papers are freely available on my website. So that's just my first name, Rashina.com. And so you go under there, there's publications, and you can find all of those publications in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
and we'll put that on the show notes so that our listeners can go and research that a bit further.
Awesome.
Okay, Rashina, so the last question there is that, is there one book that you still go back to when you think about continuing your, development or learning about Agile practices? One book maybe that you advise your students to read?
If I had to choose one book, it's very difficult, but the one I think I'll choose is Agile Retrospectives. It's one of my all-time favorites. And reason being, I think of all the different Agile practices, the one that really brings it back home is reflection. So the whole idea of inspect and adapt, so being able to adapt your practices and then work around uncertainty, is pivoted around the idea of reflection. And that's captured, of course, with retrospectives. And with that book in particular, does such a good job of, making that fun in a way that you can, revisit that whole process again and again with renewed interest, as individually and as a team. So that's the one I'll definitely recommend. And if I were to add one of the academic papers that still continues to be the hallmark paper for setting up the scene for Agile, not just in the industry, but in research, is, of course, the new product development game by Takeuchi and Nonaka. Some absolute must read. I think Agile, we all know, has started as something, become something, and then is now something else. But so it kind of is great to go back to that paper to really revisit the basics of where did it come from.
Tell us a little bit more about what you found insightful and perhaps even determining in your career from that paper.
As you noted right at the beginning, so my PhD was about self-organizing teams. And when I started looking at this in 2006, it was really just a buzzword. It's like, Agile teams are self-organizing, but really, what does that mean? So the first paper that really kind of broke that into pieces and then really explained it for me was the new product development game. Then that one actually talks about the conditions for self-organization, right? So what does it really mean in that sense? And when I stepped into the industry and I collected my own data, it was amazing to come back and see how well it reflected against what was said in the new product development game paper. So things like, minimum specifications. So you're letting people decide how to do things rather than telling them how to do it. So you're just telling them the what, not the how. Requisite variety and redundancy of functions and things like that. So again, it's all about what makes for the enabling conditions where self-organization can happen or where teams can indeed become empowered. And that for me is the exciting part and something I always go back to.
And another aspect of that paper that I really cherished is that, of course, we talked about self-organization. That's definitely a big part on it. But for me, that was the first paper that really made it absolutely clear that you need cross-functional teams, that the functional organizations we live within do not allow for knowledge work, complex work to succeed. They are kind of a drag, an obstacle to that. What do you think about that, Rashina?
Yeah, and I'll draw on my very small but very useful industry experience that I had coming straight out of my bachelor's as a software developer. We were a team of developers, and then when they were the team of testers, and we were pitched against each other just by the nature of the jobs that we did, right? So our job was to develop software and features, and their job it was to break it apart and say this is wrong and this isn't working. So by nature, we were, pitched against each other. Exactly. So the first time I had the chance to take control of a project and to propose a project, instinctively, and this is even before I was introduced to Agile, instinctively, what the first thing I did was bring everyone who was related to that project, the testers, the developers, the business analysts, everyone into one room And we talked about how this is our project and we're not pitched against each other. And the experience for that project was super different to any other project. And we felt like even if when the testers came up with issues, we were like, no, sure, that makes sense. You're trying to help us to get to a better quality product. So honestly, it was a game changer.
Yeah, basically you have the same goal. You want to create the best product, but you do it from a different angle. I like that you instinctively, even without knowing Agile, already did that.
Exactly. I was surprised. I think that's where it really resonated when I did come to terms with it formally. It resonated with me. But cross-functional, as you said, Vasco, that's the key to being on the same team and having the same goals.
Rashina, it's been a pleasure to have you here on this very special, weird 2020 week, the Christmas week for those listening to us. Maybe just one last question. If you had one message to give out to the Agile community, based on your experience, your research, the work that you're doing, what's the one message you would like to leave for the Agile community?
Well, that's a big one. So many things. I think the one thing that I can possibly say is an idea that I came up with that hopefully helps people is that idea of Agile Nations. So in 2019, I presented a TED Talk on the idea of Agile Nations. And that would be the message I give out to the community is to think big. So of course, we have expanded out of software into almost every other domain, retail, banking, everything out there. But with the Agile Nations concept, I really took my theory that was based fundamentally in software engineering and I applied it to the wider societal context. So talking about how societies and governments can be agile. So yeah, think big. We're already everywhere, but there is no boundary and there is no limit. Agile is a way of living. So of course, it continues to be relevant.
That was a brilliant and inspiring message. Thank you for that, Rashina.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Where can people find out more about you? Is that the website that you talked about, rashina.com, or is there something else you would like people to go to if they want to get in touch?
I think that would be the best one because it's got all my publications, but it also got links to all my talks and podcasts and interviews and so on. So that should be the one place. Of course, if you're on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter quite a lot, so that would be my handle is @AgileRashina.
Absolutely. We'll put all the links on the show notes so that people can easily find you and get in touch. So Yves and Rashina, thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me. I absolutely enjoyed it, Vasco. And thanks, Yves.
Yeah, I always enjoy it with Vasco and Rashina. I'm glad that I asked you to be the first here for this session because it was a very wonderful moment to have.
Well, thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed this special episode on continuous delivery. If you did, please share this episode with your colleagues and spread the message about continuous delivery and how it can help your team and your business.